When people talk about their Mount Rushmore of MMA, they tend to talk about who they think are the best fighters. The problem with that logic is we've had multiple generations of MMA. This is a relatively new sport that's only been around for about 30 years. We've had the original days of people that were great at one single thing. We have modern MMA where people are good at everything. So if you're trying to say who are the best fighters that have ever lived, that original generation is going to be left in the dust. A world champion Hoist Gracie in his prime would get absolutely smoked by a lower tier UFC fighter today. But a lot of that has to do with the fact that Hoist Gracie essentially invented this sport. I'm going to walk you through my Mount Rushmore of MMA, and it has nothing to do with who the best fighters are. Mount Rushmore was created to honor some of the most influential presidents in the history of the United States. Everything from our first president ever to the president who freed the slaves. It wasn't a subjective who's the best president of all time, but more of an objective, these four people had some of the greatest influence on our country. And that's how I'm going to approach the Mount Rushmore of MMA. Not who the greatest fighter was, or even who the greatest fighter was of that generation, but which fighters essentially created the sport that we have today. Which four fighters had the most amount of influence on the sport that we all love? And I'm going to start that off with Hoist Gracie. If you don't know how the UFC was started, I'm about to give you a little history lesson. And it's not what you think. The UFC wasn't created as a sport. It was essentially an infomercial. The Gracies came over from Brazil and they started to expose Americans to jiu-jitsu. The Brazilian jiu-jitsu way was here, but it wasn't necessarily taking off the same way that karate did in the early 90s. So the Gracies had the idea. They said, you know what? Why don't we challenge other gyms? We'll challenge karate masters. We'll challenge other people and we'll show them that jiu-jitsu is the best way. They then expanded on that idea and created the UFC. The Ultimate Fighting Championship was essentially an infomercial for jiu-jitsu. The Gracie family looked around and said, which one of us is a scrawny, dweeby looking guy with no athleticism who isn't strong? And that was Hoist Gracie. He was the runt of the Gracie pack. They sent him out there to compete against giant physical specimens of men. Boxers, wrestlers, kickboxers, karate practitioners, and he tore through them. Wasn't very strong, wasn't very fast, not very athletic, didn't hit very hard. Little Hoist Gracie showed the world that you can't win fist fights on physicality alone. You need actual skills. And without that, we don't have MMA as it is today. And I will even further that point by saying if they grabbed a different Gracie, if they grabbed a bigger, stronger, more physically imposing Gracie, it still wouldn't have had the impact that we have. The fact that it was Hoist running through physical specimens is why we have what we have today. He showed the world you need skills, you need to evolve, you need to get better, because you can't just rely on throwing punches. Hoist Gracie showed the world you needed skills to fight, and then Tito Ortiz took that and showed the world if you're entertaining, you can make money doing this. Tito Ortiz is my second person on the Mount Rushmore of MMA. He was one of the first people ever to take a well-rounded skill set and then add the theatrics on top. He was talking trash. He was creating rivalries. He was the bad boy of MMA. But without the personalities, there's only so many times you can rely on a small guy fighting a sumo wrestler. There's only so many times you can watch somebody get punched in the nuts before the commission came along and said, can't do that. So we needed a Tito Ortiz. We needed a big personality to take the sport from wild, banned cage fights to an actual sport with regulation. Because once they took away the crotch shots, once they added weight classes, once they did a few of these other things, the sport wasn't the wild, barbaric spectacle that it used to be. And with that, you lose some fans. There were people watching fights just because they were crazy. What you needed were superstars. And Tito Ortiz was one of the very first superstars in the UFC. He had the skill sets because he was the second generation of fighter. He had the wrestling, he learned the jiu-jitsu, he learned kickboxing, but he also had the personality. He invented the grave digger, the drag the body into the whole celebration. He started the trash talk. And while he is a meme today for the insane things that he says and his inability to form a coherent sentence, in the 90s, in the early 2000s, Tito Ortiz carried the UFC and showed the world, if you come out here and you talk some shit and you make it a spectacle, you too can make some very real money. Without Tito Ortiz, we do not have this modern MMA. Tito Ortiz is absolutely, without question, one of the most influential people that have ever graced this sport. That takes me to the third fighter on the Mount Rushmore of MMA, and it has to be Georges St Pierre. And it's Georges St Pierre for a few reasons. One is the obvious reason, his accomplishments. He's one of the greatest welterweight fighters of all time. It is still debated today if he is the greatest welterweight fighter of all time or potentially the greatest fighter of all time. The big debate for this era, for the third generation of MMA, is it Anderson Silva or is it Georges St Pierre? The reason I went with Georges St Pierre over Anderson Silva is because Brazil was already a massive market for the UFC. We had the ultimate Brazil competition in the 90s. So Anderson Silva being a massive superstar in Brazil wasn't new to the UFC. He didn't speak a ton of English, so it took longer than it should have for him to become a superstar here in the US. But Georges St Pierre showed up young, hungry, athletic, and skilled, and he brought Canada with him. Without Georges St Pierre, we don't have the Great White North fan base. They always had Brazil. They always had America. Now they have added Canada, and that's when the UFC said there are massive markets outside of the US. Georges St Pierre also helped create the Mega Gym. He was at Faraz Sahabi's gym. He was at Greg Jackson, the Jackson Wink Camp. And he created super camps. People followed somebody with the wild success of Georges St Pierre. Well, if he's training here, I should too. Georges St Pierre catapulted this to an international sport. He appealed to French people. He appealed to Canadians. He appealed to Americans. He was an exciting guy to watch. He was one of the most accomplished fighters of that generation, if not of all time. And Georges St Pierre has to be on the Mount Rushmore of MMA. And that takes us to the fourth and final pillar of the Mount Rushmore of MMA, and it's a controversial one. It has to be Conor McGregor. If we're talking skill sets alone, then you'll see a John Jones on somebody's list. But I'm not talking about skill sets. I'm talking about the most influential fighters in the history of this sport. The four fighters that helped this sport become what it is, and Conor McGregor is undeniable. He is by far the most famous combat athlete on planet Earth. Conor McGregor is a household name whether you have ever seen a fight or not. You can ask your grandparents who Conor McGregor is, and they know. They may have a negative opinion of him. They may know that he hit an old man in a bar. They may have seen him do the twitchy drug addict nonsense that he's doing today, but they know who he is. Conor McGregor has transcended this sport. Conor McGregor made over $100 million to box Floyd Mayweather. The most famous boxer of all time and the most famous MMA fighter of all time got together and made it happen. He is without question the most influential fighter of this generation. This is my Mount Rushmore of MMA. I'm curious what yours is. Again, I did this. The fuck? Fucking shit has a mind of its own. These are the four fighters who I think have influenced this sport more than anybody else. The four most influential fighters that have given us the sport that we love and know today. I am curious what your Mount Rushmore is. Leave a comment below and let me know.